Here in the Austrian Alps, I picture myself standing where, about 3,500 years ago, Bronze Age miners carved deep shafts and winding galleries straight into the mountainside. I imagine them working by the shaky glow of tapers and oil lamps, wearing sturdy leather shoes and whatever passed for protective headgear back then. They climbed down wooden scaffolds, ladders, and stairways shaped from pine trees chopped from the slopes above. With nothing more than stone hammers and bronze picks, they chipped away at the rock and hauled whatever they dug out up to the surface in baskets and bags. But these miners weren't down there hunting for copper or tin, at least not in this particular place. Instead, they were after something else entirely: halite or solid rock salt. Pulling this precious material out of the earth, and then trading it, helped the local chiefs rise in wealth and influence as the Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age. Over time, their early Celtic ancestors would play a major role in shaping Europe. Still, this wasn't the very first corner of the continent to grow rich by producing and trading salt. Long before that, thousands of years earlier, back in the Neolithic, the earliest farmers of Europe built a settlement over a highly prized salt deposit. The resource was so valuable that the town stayed occupied for nearly 1,000 years, eventually turning into a fortified stronghold just to protect that treasure and the prosperity that came with it. Across prehistoric Europe, people tapped into all kinds of salt sources using different methods. There were brine springs in the Carpathians, chunks of rock salt pulled out of alpine mines, and broad salt marshes on the eastern coast of England. But it makes you wonder, what was everyone using this salt for? Who actually did the backbreaking work, and who ended up ruling over these valuable operations? And in what ways did salt production and trade reshape entire societies from the Neolithic right through the Iron Age? That's the surprising story behind how salt helped transform prehistoric Europe. On a different note, when I'm out for my daily 5-mile walk, sometimes more, I usually listen to audiobooks or various research papers. A lot of those books are pretty hefty, and the papers can pile up fast, but thankfully the gel tips on my earbuds stay comfortable for hours, and the battery lasts a solid 8 hours, so I never end up without sound. If any of that sounds good to you, feel free to check out the link I've got down below. You can pick up the Everyday Earbuds Classic model, now with active noise cancellation. Just head over to buyraken.com/Dan Davis for 20% off the fan-favorite Everyday Earbuds Classic, courtesy of Raken. Nowadays, we barely think about salt at all. It's something we just shake, grind, or sprinkle over our meals without a second thought. Whether it's table salt, sea salt flakes, or coarser rock salt. But this stuff, sodium chloride, is a whole lot more important to us animals than just being a flavor boost. Our bodies rely on sodium and chloride ions for essential functions. Without enough salt, we'd start feeling worn out, weak, and in extreme cases we could actually die. Luckily for our ancestors, salt is naturally abundant in the environment. Hunter-gatherers usually got enough of it through the foods they ate, especially from the meat and blood of the animals they hunted and from certain plants they gathered. Still, the level of salt in plants and animals depends heavily on the landscape. Some regions have salter soils, especially closer to the coast. Salt is most famously dissolved in seawater, but not all prehistoric people lived by the ocean. During the Paleolithic and Mesolithic, some hunter-gatherer groups may have intentionally traveled to salt-rich places when they needed to top up their sodium levels, much like animals instinctively visiting salt licks or digging into mineral-rich clays. The tricky thing is that behavior like this doesn't leave clear archaeological traces behind. But Europe's oceans weren't the only natural source of salt. Sodium chloride also forms halite, a stable crystalline mineral found in massive underground deposits, remnants of ancient seas from hundreds of millions of years ago. These salt layers sit between sedimentary rocks and can eventually form towering salt domes over geological timescales, sometimes even reaching the surface. Prehistoric mining of these formations was rare, but groundwater could dissolve the halite and carry it upward, producing natural brine springs. There's a real possibility that Mesolithic groups used these springs. Archaeologists have even tried mapping Mesolithic artifacts, like stone tools, against known brine spring locations to spot a connection. Since Mesolithic people didn't leave behind much evidence of heavy landscape modification, we can't clearly see how or even if they processed brine. Still, we do have a clue from southeastern France. worked wooden timbers from a brine well that were radiocarbon dated to around 5700 BC, right at the tail end of the Mesolithic in that region. Those timbers might have formed a simple enclosure meant for solar evaporation, basically letting the sun slowly dry out standing brine until only the salt remained, ready to be gathered. And around that same time, maybe even a little earlier, the very first farming communities of Europe were spreading through the Balkans. These groups followed the river valleys, looking for new land to settle and cultivate. I've come to think that those early farming communities probably went looking for extra salt sources, especially once their diets shifted towards cereal crops instead of meat, and even more so as they moved farther inland, away from the coast. Their livestock would have needed extra salt too, so it makes sense that easy-to-reach salt deposits might have been one of the things people looked for when deciding where to set up a new village, right alongside the usual necessities like fresh water, timber, and good clay. Because of all the halite buried below the surface, the Eastern Carpathians ended up with tons of natural salt springs. One of the most interesting spots out there is a place called Poiana Slatina in Romania, basically meaning salt spring meadow or salt clearing. Some folks even call it the oldest salt production site in the world, though a few other places try to claim that title too. The oldest radiocarbon dates from there go all the way back to about 1600 BC. That's also around the time we first see a special kind of salt processing material called briquettage. Briquettage is the name for these thick, coarse ceramic containers made specifically for boiling brine. Workers would smash the pots to get the solid salt cakes out, so each pot was just a single-use item. Over time, this created enormous heaps of broken ceramic, so big and so obvious that people have been noticing them for centuries. The term briquettage was actually coined back in 1740 by a French military engineer and early antiquarian. He kept coming across these brick-like mounds in eastern France and realized they were the remains of old salt-making operations. In the Carpathians, this method of producing salt started right at the beginning of the Neolithic and continued well into the Chalcolithic. Different salt springs vary in strength and even shift with the weather or the seasons, but people could still collect the salty water and use it as brine. In fact, that tradition of using brine straight from the springs carried on into pretty recent times. Folks would add it to soups, use it to preserve dairy, and so on. But if you wanted solid salt, actual crystals, you had to evaporate the water. So from the Neolithic onward, people filled sturdy clay containers with brine and slowly heated them over a fire. As the water evaporated, salt crystals built up inside. When the process was done, the pot had to be broken open so the salt cakes could be taken out, stored, carried off, or traded. All those busted ceramic pieces got tossed aside, and it's those heaps of debris that archaeologists now call briquettage. Across Europe, these piles are one of the clearest signs of prehistoric salt production, showing up from the Neolithic all the way to the Iron Age, though they weren't the only technique in use. Back in those early days, salt making was probably a small-scale, seasonal activity, carried out by the local community for its own needs. People would have seasoned their food and fed it to their animals, of course, but they also used salt to preserve meat and to prepare hides. Being able to store food longer and prevent spoilage could have helped them get through rough seasons. Healthier, well-fed communities would naturally grow in number, and that's exactly what we see happening during this period. As Neolithic groups got better at metalworking and other technologies during the Chalcolithic, their societies became more complex. You start seeing specialized crafts, both within a single settlement and across whole regions. Long-distance trade networks formed, and new communities sprang up far from their origins as people tried to control valuable resources like copper. Settlements were often protected by large defensive systems, ditches, banks, palisades, sometimes on a scale that's pretty astounding. And one remarkable site near Prevadia in Bulgaria seems to have taken salt production to a whole new level. This region sits on the only major salt deposit around for miles. People have been extracting salt here for thousands of years, and the springs were first tapped as early as roughly 5500 BC. The massive mound of human occupation, called a tell, goes by the name Salnitsata or the Salt Works. Some even refer to it as Europe's oldest town. During the Neolithic, people here used clay ovens and ceramic pots to process salt, both inside the settlement and out by the brine springs. That activity carried on into the late Chalcolithic, up until around 4500 to 4200 BC, which was when the entire region entered a period of decline. Salnitsata was plugged into a wide-reaching trade network that moved gold and copper from the Balkan Mountains, shells like spondylus from the Aegean, and other prized materials such as obsidian, both as raw resources and as finely crafted tools and ornaments. Only about 40 kilometers from Salnitsata lies the famous Varna Cemetery, home to the oldest known gold treasure in the world. This is where the earliest elite metalworkers and chiefs were laid to rest, surrounded by an astonishing amount of gold objects and weaponry. It really shows how interconnected these sites were. Salnitsata itself was heavily fortified, surrounded by a defensive ditch or moat, stone walls, stone bastions, and wooden palisades. These wraparound defenses, combined with the site's economic specialization and trade connections, have led some researchers to view the place as a kind of proto-town, maybe one of the earliest hints at urban life in Europe. There's also evidence of ritual activity in and around the site, including a figurine mask in the style of the Vinca culture. Excavations take place for just 2 months each summer, and there's still a massive amount left buried, waiting to be uncovered. Whenever I read about places like this, I can't help drifting into daydreams about what life must have felt like for the folks who lived there more than 6,000 years ago. The whole community probably only numbered a few hundred people at most. Their daily routines would have been tough but steady, hauling brine from the springs, chopping timber to keep the fires going, digging up clay for ovens, and shaping the ceramic jars used to evaporate the salt. They would have woven bags and baskets to haul the finished salt cakes, and I imagine they built and paddled simple boats to send their goods upriver or downriver to trade with neighbors, maybe even with the metalworking specialists up in Varna. I often wonder what those people believed spiritually. What did they think about this strange, powerful substance rising from the earth, almost like a gift from gods that lived somewhere deep below? Another place that really sparks my imagination sits over 1,000 kilometers to the northwest, dating to the Bronze Age, the salt mines of Hallstatt. Once you start digging into the subject, there's actually a surprising amount of research on prehistoric salt. The best general overview I've come across is by Anthony Harding. There's also the well-known book Salt, A World History by Mark Kurlansky, which is a fun read, and then a whole stack of more technical papers focusing on particular regions or sites. As usual, I'll leave some solid sources in the description. During the Bronze Age in Europe, most salt came from natural salt springs, or from evaporating seawater along the coasts. I'll get deeper into that later, but both approaches depended on briquettage, those single-use ceramic containers used to boil down brine over a fire. But there were also places where people went straight for the mineral itself, mining halite rock salt instead of just collecting brine. In some areas, halite reached the surface and could be quarried directly. Most of those old surface quarries have been reworked so many times over the centuries that any prehistoric traces were wiped away long ago. Still, a few hints have survived here and there. In places like Transylvania and Ukraine, archaeologists have found wooden troughs with holes drilled into them, clearly used for some kind of salt processing method. In Romania, hollowed-out tree trunks dating to the Bronze Age, from around the 16th to the 9th centuries BC, have been uncovered as well. This region saw industrial-scale salt production using clay-lined wicker tanks, sometimes with roofs, to hold large amounts of brine. Those carved troughs might have been used to drip fresh water down onto the rock salt. Each trough had holes plugged with bits of wood, and those plugs had tiny perforations holding cords that dangled downward. As the water dripped along the cords, it dissolved the exposed halite beneath, weakening it until workers could pry chunks loose. Modern tests show this technique actually works. Another idea that's been tested successfully is that brine itself was poured into the troughs so it could slowly drip onto textile sheets below, leaving behind salt crystals that were easy to collect. True mining, cutting deep shafts and tunnels underground, was dangerous, skilled work. Most prehistoric mines for metals like copper and tin were completely destroyed by later mining in the same locations, and salt mines may have suffered the same fate. But in Hallstatt, the famous salt region of Austria, some prehistoric mine workings survived. Most of the surviving tunnels date to the Iron Age, when salt mining expanded massively, but deep mining here actually began in the Bronze Age, around 1450 BC. Underground, miners built wooden structures like scaffolds, and one remarkable staircase has survived, often called the oldest wooden staircase in the world. Tree ring studies show the timber came from a tree cut down in 1344 BC. What remains is about 1.8 meters wide and 8 meters long. Judging from the angle of the steps, the staircase must have originally been positioned much steeper, probably to help miners cross over heaps of broken rock from earlier digging. Archaeologists have found other staircase fragments too. Because the air in the mines is packed with salt, microbial decay is almost non-existent, so wood, leather, and other organic materials have been preserved incredibly well. We can't say for sure who the actual miners were, who those people were working by the shaky light of spruce and fir torches and oil lamps, but we do know the mine itself was absolutely crucial for whoever controlled it during the Urnfield period. These people are known from the thousands of Bronze Age and Iron Age burials discovered in the region. The sheer number of graves, the human remains, and the wealth of grave goods have given us an enormous amount of information about life at that time, especially in the early Iron Age. This huge cemetery is the reason the culture here ended up giving its name to the Proto-Celtic Hallstatt culture, one of the most influential cultural groups in prehistoric Europe. During the Bronze Age, powerful local chiefs or warlords really began rising to prominence, gaining wealth and authority through their control of important resources like salt from Hallstatt and from the nearby Durnberg site near Hallien. As metal weapons became more common, eventually shifting from bronze to iron, these leaders consolidated even more power. By the Iron Age, roughly 800 BC to 100 BC, salt production across Europe reached levels of efficiency and scale that had never been seen before. Population growth and technological improvements pushed demand higher and higher, and increasingly complex societies needed both stable ways to preserve food and reliable goods for trade. Most of what we know archaeologically about European salt production actually comes from this era. Down in Mediterranean coastal areas, people could rely on nothing more than sunlight to evaporate seawater for salt. But up in northwestern Europe, even summer temperatures weren't warm enough for that, so folks had to get creative. That's where archaeologists and early antiquarians started noticing these huge heaps of shattered briquettage, piles of broken ceramic from places where seawater had been concentrated and boiled down. In eastern England, these reddish mounds were known as the Red Hills. One of the biggest clusters of these ancient salt-making spots was in coastal Essex. The stretch of the River Blackwater between Malden and Mersey Island has been famous for salt production for ages. Even today, it's home to one of the most respected sea salt brands in the world, Malden Sea Salt. The salt marshes along the north bank of this tidal river are naturally rich in salt because of the way the tides move, the way the creeks flood and drain, and the way salt builds up over time. The water in those creeks gets so salty that, traditionally, kids from the region were brought here to learn how to swim. They'd float a little easier thanks to the extra buoyancy. And the air and soil are so saturated with salt that local orchards are better protected from late frosts. The livestock that graze on the marsh, sheep and cattle, end up especially healthy and, frankly, pretty delicious. Salt working has shaped this whole region for centuries, from the Middle Ages right into modern times. You see it in place names, villages and streets named after salt, and in the landscape itself. Those brackish creeks and broad salt marshes create a place that's not quite land, not quite sea, forming a weird sort of in-between world. Back in the Iron Age, salt production here was probably seasonal and relatively small-scale. People used a whole range of methods to concentrate the brine, digging clay-lined pits, carving wooden troughs, and eventually boiling the salty water in ceramic vessels, which produced the broken heaps of briquettage later generations would call Red Hills. Essex alone has more than 300 of these Red Hill sites. Similar places have been found across England, dating to both the Iron Age and the Roman period, usually clustered around estuaries. Some salt was used locally, but much of it was traded inland to towns and settlements where demand was highest. What's interesting is that different sites, sometimes just within eyesight of each other, used different techniques, suggesting that salt-making methods were often passed down within families or tight-knit communities. Each group had its own way of doing things, and those traditions stuck. These huge mounds of debris built up over generations remind me a little of the shell middens created by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. On the surface, sure, they're just piles of industrial waste. But if you think about it, they were also monuments, physical reminders of the labor, the skill, and the continuity of the people who came before. Folks likely worked the same ground their ancestors had worked, learning the same techniques and adding their own contributions to the mound. There's even some evidence suggesting that people saw the Red Hills as more than just work sites. Possible ritual deposits and a few nearby burials hint that these places may have held spiritual meaning too. In their eyes, these heaps weren't only trash. They were tied to ancestry, tradition, and maybe even reverence. Today, many of the Red Hills in Essex have been leveled by flood defenses or plowed flat by farmers. Even so, you can still spot fragments of briquettage on the surface, along the seawalls, at the edges of fields, or eroding out of muddy marsh banks. Together with coastal sea salt production, inland mining and brine spring processing meant that by the Iron Age, salt was readily available across much of prehistoric Europe. These regional salt traditions didn't disappear either. Many of them carried right on into Roman times and beyond, eventually developing into large-scale salt pans along both the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts. Some of those salt works are still in operation today. There's a saying you sometimes hear that, in the ancient world, salt was more valuable than gold. Most people today know that isn't true. Gold has always held the top spot. That old idea probably came from misunderstandings about trans-Saharan trade routes, where gold was relatively common but salt was rarer and harder to transport. Still, in prehistoric Europe, salt could absolutely be a valuable commodity depending on where you lived and when. Some communities and some individuals grew wealthy and powerful because they controlled its production and trade. These days we hardly give salt a second thought, but thousands of years ago, as people learned to transform the strange mineral through increasingly complex methods, it genuinely shaped entire societies and influenced the course of European history. If you enjoy stories like this, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a lot and makes sure you won't miss future videos. I also want to thank my patrons and channel members. Your support is what lets me visit all these incredible archaeological sites and film the salt marshes of Essex and other amazing places. If you haven't joined yet, feel free to check out the links in the description. And if you'd like to keep exploring, I recommend watching my video on the largest copper mine of the ancient world, the extraordinary mines of Kargali. Thanks so much for watching.